Is this me? I'll say it to myself so you don't think that I'm crazy. This club is soulless and I think that I would rather be writing the pages of a book that you'll read quietly inside your house all by yourself. That's where I wanna be.
Welcome to today's living room session and author a day book reading. We are delighted to be joined by 3 authors and 1 photographer. Beowulf Sheehan, a portrait photographer whose work you can see in his book called Author. Jessica Pearce Rotondi, a writer, editor, and author of the book What We Inherit. Stephen Kiernan, a novelist, journalist, and the author of Universe of Two. And Shanbhag Lang, author of What We Carry, a memoir. Welcome, I'm Monica Jiang. I'm one of your hosts today. This is my living room, and I'm the head of content and community at the House of Beautiful Business. And I'm currently reading On Writing by Stephen King, which actually my colleague Megan Husted gifted me, and I'm very delighted to be co-hosting the first session with her today. So please give a warm welcome to Megan, who's the managing editor at the House of Beautiful Business. Hi, Megan.
Hi, thank you, Monica. It's lovely to see you as always. Hello, everyone. I am reading Cutout Girl by Bartman S., which my sister gave me a long time ago, and of course I didn't have time to read until now, but I'm reading it for pleasure and for research for another project.
And we always, we also want to know what you guys are all reading. So if you want to share that in the chat or just hold up your book cover and show it in the gallery view, that would be nice. And for those of you who are joining, nice, I'm seeing a lot of books now. For those of you who are joining for the first time, the House of Beautiful Business is a membership-based global think tank and community to make humans more human and business more beautiful. We host an annual gathering in Lisbon, Portugal, as well as other smaller gatherings all around the world. And we produce online programming such as these living room sessions, which we started at the beginning of this year and in light of the coronavirus crisis made public and free until the end of May, and we extended just that so you can enjoy and hopefully come back into this living room. And before we start, 2 quick house rules. So you can enjoy the session as always best in gallery view, so you can switch that on the top right of your window. And if you would like to chime in with a question or a comment or your book, then please do so in the chat as always.
Today's session is obviously about the power of books to change people's situation in life, not just in granting them some kind of escape, entertainment, but by giving them the imagination to envision their lives and the lives of their community differently. So I have been in the book business as a writer and an editor for about 20 years now. Hurts a little to say that, but and before that, I sold books. I was a bookshop girl, and I moved to New York because of books, because at the time that was the only place to be in the US if you wanted to live for and amongst books. So to say that books have shaped my life is no understatement. But in those 20 years, the book business has undergone many changes, at least in the US. I think it's true globally. There's been consolidations and mergers, and it's changed the character of publishing as an industry a bit, it's safe to say. And now there's more competition from streaming and Twitter, and all of these things compete for readers' attention. But on the positive side, I think we've seen a lot of changes and technology-wise that are making, I hope, and I sincerely believe that publishing will become much more exciting in the years ahead. We just produced a book at the House last year with a global team of contributors, and you can do that now in a fraction of the day. There it is. Christine, thank you very much. Beowulf also makes a brief appearance in this book, and you can do that now for a fraction of the cost and a fraction of the time that it used to. So that's very exciting. But one thing that hasn't changed about books and publishing is that you need a lot of people to write a book, or I should say to write your first drafts. You need solitude. But after every point from then on out, you need a whole team of people. You need editors, you need designers, you need publicists, marketing professionals, and it always helps to have a good author photograph. Which brings us to our first guest, Beowulf Sheehan. Beowulf, thank you so much for joining us. Some of you had the pleasure of seeing him present at the House of Beautiful Business in Lisbon last fall, and now he's here on Zoom.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
He's here to discuss his initiative, An Author a Day, and we'll hear more about that later. But first of all, Beowulf, I imagine it must be hard to do what you do, given that it's discouraged, shall we say, to be in the same room with people. So how are you doing amidst all this?
I'm doing as well as I can. People have given me so very much over these last 15 years working in publishing, such that I now have this time to give back to them, which is exactly what An Author a Day is.
Okay, and we'll hear more about that later. But first, I just have to, if you'll indulge me, I have to make a little commercial for the house, and I hope Beowulf will back me up in what I'm about to say. So Beowulf is my neighbor. He lives 5 blocks from me. He has for years. Before that, we both lived in separate apartments, but also just blocks away from each other. But we didn't know that. We had never met, even though we know dozens of people in common, until the house last year. So if you too want to meet an internationally recognized portrait photographer and all-around really, really nice guy, you should join the House of Beautiful Business community. And with that, let's look at some pictures, shall we?
Gladly. So hi everyone, I hope you can see these photographs. This of course is the cover of my book, Author, which is the front cover of my book is the back cover of The Goldfinch, written by Donna Tartt, who you see in this picture. So as Megan had kindly just said, we were and still are very much neighbors. And here are pictures that were made. And of course, in Megan's very backyard, New York City speaking, if you will. And this is, of course, the picture that became the author portrait. What you can't see in this picture is how Donna, many people, and I feel about New York City. There's a love and hate relationship we have with the city, but you can see it very well expressed in what's her body's blocking in this picture, and if you look closely, not blocking in this picture. Moving on, Salman Rushdie. He's been a very kind soul to me for better than 10 years now. After this picture was made, my client asked him about his time of hiding in 10 years after the fatwa was issued by the Ayatollah Khomeini, and his response was, if you notice, you'll see that one of us is dead and one of us is not. Joan Didion, the only writer I've ever photographed who in all the time with that subject didn't say a single word back to me. She did all her speaking with her eyes. Ron Chernow, who gave us Alexander Hamilton, which became, of course, the musical Hamilton. Margaret Atwood. Jonathan Franzen. The job here was just to make a single, simple, one-light picture of him against a gray background. My assistant and I succeeded in leaving our gray background at the top of the steps of my building, so it's that when we got to his home, we were very, very fortunate to have in his home already a gray wall, which meant we had to do some house cleaning. So here's Jonathan cleaning up. Before we dove in, Gloria Steinem, wonderful world-renowned feminist, 80 years beautiful in this image. Bret Easton Ellis in his home in Los Angeles. Gary Brownstein. Not all storytellers limit themselves to just books. There are many, many different ways, different art forms to tell your story. Terrell Alvin McCraney, who gave us Moonlight. Patti Smith came to New York wanting to be a poet, and my goodness, was she so much more. Lou Reed, I was told that ahead of time that he was a bit of a tough customer, that he could be rude, and when I met him, I reached out with my hand to shake his, and he didn't take my hand. Instead, he just said nothing below the waist. And this is a picture I made for the New York Public Library, and he was to see some things from the archive there. By the end of that half hour, he was holding a paper by his hero, Edgar Allan Poe, showing it back to me, smiling. He left that session looking at me and our colleagues and said, thanks for one of the greatest days of my life. J.K. Rowling, very shy, very kind, very quiet. She didn't wish to be photographed, but it was necessary. I asked her, that's okay. You can turn away if that works for you, and she did. Malcolm Gladwell. Jessamine Ward, the first woman to win the National Book Award in the United States for fiction twice. I only had 20 minutes with her. That's because outside of the screen was her newborn son, Brando. I asked her why the name Brando. She said, my partner and I were thinking of something with the letter B. And I said, what about Beowulf? She said, no. This is Sarah J. Moss, who just has a new work of fantasy out last month called House of Blood. And working with her in her home, New Jersey, we had similar concerns because we're at home, which meant every few minutes she had to take care of her son, Taran. Neil Gaiman, fantasy writer. Tom Stoppard, great playwright. Ian McEwan at his home just outside of London. This is where he writes. The great Chinua Achebe, author of Things Fall Apart, considered perhaps the greatest writer in the history of the continent of Africa. He wasn't a very smiley person, and his son was behind me asking me how much longer this would take because it was his birthday, and I said, oh, it's your birthday. Happy birthday, Dr. Achebe, which led to this big smile. That's as big as it would have ever gotten with the great Dr. Achebe. And look how wonderful the smile of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Nigeria's now most renowned writer. Yeonmi Park, human rights activist for whom I photographed the cover of her memoir, In Order to Live. She was concerned that the picture would lead to death threats, which it did. And as tough and emotionally what an experience it was to make this picture, at the very end of it, she checked her Facebook feed and learned that her friend of 20 years ago had managed to escape from North Korea, which led to this much joy. Carlo Vanoscod, gentle giant, very quiet. After we made this picture for the cover of a book at the campus of Yale, minutes later, there were about 25 people there to celebrate him, and he just wanted to be alone. Marianne Satrapi, author of Persepolis, the steely eyes and heart of Roberto Saviano, the only person I've ever photographed with police protection around us. Daniel Kehlmann, a German writer who in this picture is wearing my jacket. Erte Müller, winner of the Nobel Prize, Romanian-born, now calls Germany home. The great Elie Wiesel, kind, sad eyes, but what a gentle, beautiful heart. Toni Morrison, icon of the art form, who we sadly lost last year. And some people will be celebrating today along with their works. Jessica Pearce Rotondi. She can tell you the story behind this picture, of course, because that is a metaphor for the story she's going to share with you. Stephen Kiernan. And the lovely Maya Lang. Thank you all so very much.
Fun to hear some of the stories behind it. Now, I was wondering, what makes authors good subjects?
Authors are great subjects, not good subjects, but great subjects, because they're just like every single one of us. They are storytellers. Each and every one of us has something to say, something to share. It is part of what makes our world spin so beautifully. When we share those stories, we further our societies, our cultures, ourselves. And all I wish them to be is their beautiful selves. They're already taking that step, writers, in putting their work out there. This is a chance to put your face out there too. If I'm willing to be so vulnerable to say, this is me, I've spent years of my life putting this story on the page to share. Here's my face, here's my smile, here's my energy too.
So when you work with an author,
yes,
what's your process like? How do you get to the stage where you can feel like you're helping them present who they are?
I think of the cliche, the quote by Ben Franklin, luck favors the preparer, which for me begins with reading the work.
Wait, what was that thing from Benjamin Franklin again?
Luck favors the prepared.
Luck favors the Okay.
And so I prepare by reading that author's work. If I don't read the work, I don't know what's going on in that person's head and heart, that person that's just then a face and body. And that's not all I'm there to celebrate. Yes, that's how we represent ourselves, these vessels in which we carry what we have to say as beings. But if I know the story, that person's then sharing with me his or their aesthetic message, wished for what it is that's so important to share with the world. That's a great place at which to start. And there's something in that story for all of us, no matter what story it is we have to share, there is something in there that will touch you. Something is in common. Something will resonate with your life if you've been on this earth long enough, and I've been around a bit.
So can you tell us more about an author a day? and how it came about?
Gladly, gladly. Well, of course, my livelihood depends on the ability to safely, freely have another human being in front of me. And I can't do that any longer. But what I do have is an archive of work. I've photographed close to 900 writers from 50 plus countries in these last 15 years. So that then prompted the thought that this is a chance for me to say thank you. And there are people out there, I'm sure, who are not as fortunate as I am, and maybe I can do something to help them. So having this body of work meant that, goodness, if we need to go 900 days of this, I'll be prepared. So
900?
Well, that's how many pictures, that's how many writers I've photographed, but let's hope we never get to that number.
That would be a happy, maybe.
So then each day to celebrate a storyteller, to call attention to that person's work, and thereby hopefully sell that person's books, to raise money for an organization that's been around since 1917 called the Authors League Fund, which is meeting the needs of writers in dire need in the New York City area and throughout the United States right now. Could be a really beautiful thing to do. And of course I have photographed them, so I can sell prints as well. So there are three ways immediately then one can help writers: by buying the works, by buying a print, or by making a straight donation to the Authors League. Since then, I've also learned that PEN America, an organization I've worked with for 15 years, has called attention to its own emergency fund, and I'm supporting that fund by way of teaching. I'll be teaching the class on Saturday the 9th of May, and I'm also offering private tutoring lessons. All the details are on my site. But this, I feel, is my responsibility. I've had such a beautiful journey. I've met amazing human beings from throughout the world. It's time for me to say thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, I think Nora's posted the details in the chat. You can check it out on Instagram and on Beowulf's site. Now, given that you, besides this, you're still photographing, from what I understand. Are you able to share some of your new work?
I am.
Here for the first time, I think.
World premiere of this work.
World premiere of this work.
So let's hope so of course I can't work with human beings, but that doesn't mean I can't work. Assuming that this will work. Oh no. Sorry for technical difficulties. And of course now.
Chance to look at Maya's picture for longer, which is
There we go.
There we go.
But flowers are beautiful. Not as beautiful as people's hearts. However, they're worth celebrating in pictures too. So I'm learning now photographing these wonderful still lifes. These are all made in the last 2 weeks.
Imagine a very different process because you're so used to the sort of the interpersonal dynamic.
That's correct.
Which is changing by the fraction of a second when you're photographing someone, and then something very static.
Yes, the dialogue with flowers is very one-sided. they just sit there and be beautiful.
Well, not very articulate. No. Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beowulf. That was really lovely.
Love.
All right, so before we ease into the reading part of the session, I would love for you all to welcome Benjamin Schletz, who is our musician in residence, and we're very glad and happy to have him back on the living room stage. He's tuning in from Berlin and will perform from his latest project called Shanbhag. So please welcome Benja. Take it away.
Hello, everyone. I'm playing you a little lullaby.
Give him a silent applause. Thank you, Benja.
Thank you.
So in the wake of her mother's death, Jessica uncovers boxes of letters, revealing a long-lost, mysterious CIA report, which takes us back to Laos in 1972, where her uncle disappeared in a secret war. This is a glimpse into Jessica Pearce Rotondi's first book, What We Inherit, which is described as a haunting chronicle of loss and redemption, and was just released this past Tuesday, actually. So in this celebratory spirit, give a warm welcome to Jessica. Thank you for being here and for reading with us today. Hi, Jessica.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me, Monica, the House of Beautiful Business. And to Beowulf Sheehan, who I just want to briefly shout out again. I met Beowulf when I was 21 years old and volunteering for the Penn World Voices Festival, which is this international festival in New York City with authors all over the world. He was this graceful, tall presence in every single room, just capturing authors in multiple languages, sharing their work. And it was just such a privilege to be photographed by him for my first book, which is 10 years in the making. So thank you, Beowulf, for making this dream come true and making me feel like a real author. I love you. Thank you. As Monica mentioned, it's my very first book, and it's a deeply personal story. It begins in the wake of my mother's death, and it's both a memoir about my family's search for an uncle who was missing for 36 years in the war in Laos. It's a piece of investigative history into the CIA's led war there. It's the most heavily bombed country in the world because of American bombs, and my uncle was actually doing the bombing. And it's also a bit of travelogue. And because we're all kind of cooped up right now, I thought I would take us far away to Laos, to a mountain off limits to foreigners. And in the part of the book I'm going to share with you today, I'm with two people who are very important in the story. One is my good friend Liz, who accompanied me around the world on this journey. And the other is my guide, Mr. Pei, who is my translator, my only way of communicating with the people in Laos. And who wants nothing to do with American girls and a plane loaded with bombs that I'm leading all of us straight towards, and that's my uncle's plane. So in the book, I'm recreating a trip my grandfather had taken in World War II in search of his son. And what I will say also is that while we're all in quarantine right now, I've been thinking so much about my family. My grandfather was in World War II. He was shot down over Germany, was in Stalag 17 for 3 years. And for those 3 years, he didn't know if he'd make it home or not, but every night he broke curfew to read a story aloud to his fellow prisoners to kind of give them hope. He could have been killed for his actions, but he really was a defiant reminder of life for him. And years later, when my mother was undergoing chemotherapy, she read from that exact same book to feel connected to her father's strength. So how fitting that I get to read to all of you in quarantine right now when we can't be with the people that we love, but I get to share people that I love very much with you. So shall I begin reading, Monica?
Yes, so everyone just a quick note, make yourselves comfortable. And with the opening of the book of the first one for today, we begin listening and the authors will begin reading, and I would love to invite you to remain silent and during this time and really take it in and enjoy. So with this, the room is yours, Jessica.
Thank you. So I'll be reading from What We Inherit. I'll start with the prologue and then that scene towards the end of the book on the mountain. Here we go. Ours is a family that loses children. Grandpa Ed cheated death when he jumped out of a burning plane at 22. He was thrown out to the Western Front so fast he hadn't been trained to use a parachute. The German farmers who found him in their field sent him to Stalag 17 for 2.5 years. A stint that saved his life, but marked the man for good. He could never again stomach the smell of soup, though he let his grandkids play with his prison spoon. It was Ed's brother that we lost, long after the war. He drowned while on vacation in a lake, his young son and daughter watching him kick and splash as the canoe drifted away. Ed's oldest son and namesake, Edwin Jack Pearce, followed his father into the Air Force. He disappeared over the mountains of Laos at 24 and stayed missing for 36 years. Ed's daughter, my mother, found her tumor in the shower at 53. The hearts of some families would have drowned with that first boy, stopped with that plane crash, frozen at that moment of discovery. Ours kept beating because we knew what it was to wait. Chapter 20, The Crater. Savanket Province, Laos, November 23rd, 2013. Mom gone 4 years, 25 days. The sun rises over the rice fields, and from the van window, Liz and I can see the red roads and green rice paddies blurring toward the mist, fleeing the mountains. Liz tries to manage my expectations. Even if the smaller roads are passable, the likelihood of finding the crash site beyond them is slim. We have no idea if we will sent back from the park's border by police, or worse. Mr. Pei has instructed us to say tourist, tourist, and smile if we are stopped. And even if we do manage to make it through, we have no idea if there are unexploded bombs or impenetrable jungle blocking our way. The highways here require Herculean navigation, never mind the spidery network of roads crawling up the mountain. I brace myself for the first of the bridges. A calm pervades the van as we clatter our way over it. Easy. The scary part is up ahead. We've come to the police checkpoint guarding the perimeter of the park. We slipped by easily enough last night, but daytime, our guide has warned, is a different story. I suck in my breath and scrunch down in the seat. But the checkpoint is eerily quiet, the wraparound porch bare. A sleeping mutt lies just inside the open doorway. He doesn't even raise his head as we pass. I wait until I can no longer see the building in the rearview mirror to exhale. The road up the mountain becomes a green tunnel. Every few hundred feet, the trees open up to reveal blue sky and a sheer drop to the valley below. The effect is dizzying. We take a left just after the clearing from the previous night, and the van rattles down an even thinner red clay ribbon of road. The van lurches, then stops. No further, Mr. Pei says. What? Why? I ask. The road is too bad. We can't pass. Our driver begins to turn around. As the van slows in reverse, I slide the door open and jump out. Wait! I yell. Get back in the van, Mr. Pei says. Before me is a waterfall of mud, dropping down steeply to the rutted, grooved remains of a road. I have no idea how I'm getting down there, but I'm sure as hell not getting back in that car and driving away. I'm walking, Mr. Pei, I announce. You can stay here if you'd like. I slam the van door a little too loudly, and it reverberates out into the jungle around me, trees barely held black by the red clay trail. I adjust the weight of my backpack. I have enough water to last a few hours. If the terrain remains relatively steady, I can make it. You can't walk into the jungle alone, Mr. Pei says. You don't know this place. Watch me, I think. I start heading for the point where the road dips from view. The police will find you, he shouts. A second van door slams as Liz gets out and comes to stand beside me. I'm walking too. No, American girls cannot be alone in the national park. I hear Mr. Pei's heavy breathing, a muttered phrase in Lao that sounds a lot like fuck, a third door sliding open. He comes around the van and stands before Liz and me, blocking the way. If you go, I go with you, he says. I look up and down his 5'1" frame. In his flip-flops, dress pants, and semi-tucked dress shirt, Mr. Pei won't last an hour. How far, he asks, pointing at the jungle ahead. I think of the nearly 40-year-old map in my pocket, of the grieving girl of the past 4 years who could barely navigate her own life, let alone a map, of the 9 miles that stretch from where I'm standing right now up into the mountain. I lie and say 3 kilometers. You have 20 minutes, Mr. Pei says. Then we leave. Liz and I look at each other. Well, we'll just have to walk fast then, won't we? She says. We move almost sideways down the hill to keep from falling face first. Loose clumps of red dirt tumble down with each step, and I try to still my heart's pounding by focusing on the dried ripples of mud beneath my feet. Behind us, the sound of Mr. Pei's swearing grows fainter. On flat ground, and already well ahead of Mr. Pei, Liz and I begin to form a plan. I'll talk to him. You just walk as fast as you can, she tells me. She hands me the satellite phone, the black digits on the screen showing me just how far away I am from home and just how close I am to the last known place that Jack was seen alive. I think of Mom marching up to the Lao embassy in 1975 in search of her brother, the road I now stand on marked off in the map in her purse. Liz's footsteps slow behind me as I pick up my pace, each footstep matching the thudding of my heart. Jack, Jack, Jack. Above us, the sun is rising higher, extending its fingers down to the road. The world is so red, I feel as if I could be walking on the surface of Mars. I bake along with the dirt. I hear footsteps and slow as Liz catches up to me. Mr. Pei has agreed to give us a full hour. I don't know what she said, but the smile on her face as I show her the satellite phone, a few more decimals in the right direction, says it all. Jess, if the road continues up, we can potentially do this, Liz says. We double our pace. Power lines swoop high above our heads, and I recall our guide's fear at seeing them so deep in the jungle. The roads encircling the mountain, he had told us, are trafficked by loggers illegally removing hardwood trees from the forest to sell on the black market. We look as out of place as the power lines above our heads. Liz and I round a corner, and a solitary man appears in the middle of the road, walking straight toward us. His chest is bare, his face covered in dirt. He's 3 feet away. Then 2. I can see the mud in his curling toenails. Sai bai di, I say, smiling. Liz elbows me. His face parts into 2 rows of brown teeth as he returns our greeting, stepping aside at the last minute to let us pass. Did you see what he was carrying? Liz whispers. I turn and see a giant machete strapped across his back, glinting in the sun. Spooked, I reground myself. I look up at the mountain, taking a swig of water that sticks to the back of my throat. We walk on in renewed silence, my every sense heightened. The gravel behind us begins to crunch under the weight of tires. The pop and crackle slows and comes to a stop just behind my legs. I can feel the heat from the car's engine shooting hot air down the back of my calves. Shit, the police, I think. It's over. I turn around slowly. The tinted window next to my skull momentarily shows cheeks draining of red sunburn and filling with white. My cracked lips disappear last as the window rolls down to reveal the laughing face of our driver. Get in, Mr. Pei calls from the passenger seat. Crazy girls, he mutters under his breath. He has no fucking idea. As we slide the van door shut, Mr. Pei explains, it's better to have a car and all be together if we're asked to leave. You do not want to ride in a police van. He looks uncomfortable at his own joke, and I continue to look at him. After a beat, he admits, it's also too hot to walk, okay? I could hug him. The adrenaline is still pumping through my body, and the 4 of us driving together, even if only for the AC on his part, feels like a leap of faith in our mission, in me. As we drive, the coordinates on my satellite phone screen get closer and closer. By pointing the antenna out the open van window, we can obtain a reading roughly every 5 minutes. A few hundred feet of latitude off, We see a series of huts too small for human habitation rising out of a murky pond to our left. Are those to hold prisoners? Liz says. For storing rice, Mr. Pei shoots from the front seat. We are startled that he has heard us, that he was listening in, that he has understood. I recall all of the backseat conversations Liz and I had while he was playing with his phone, his translation of know nothing in Zepon, and begin to question just how much he has masked what he does and does not understand. A few hundred feet beyond the rice huts, a village comes into view. I blink to see if it's a mirage. We are within a mile of the site now, and I had pictured uninhabited environs, not huts rising out of rice fields. Rice fields! The Air Force had said that the crash site had been periodically flooded for rice farming. The people before us could be the farmers. We slow where the two roads in the village converge, in front of a sign I can't understand. A woman ducks away from the roadside where she'd been watching us, retreating to her doorway, a toddler clinging to her leg. Mr. Pei rolls down the window, tries to say something. She shakes her head. They don't speak Lao, Mr. Pei says. I can't understand her. By now, a group has gathered to gawk at the van in our midst. I recall the declassified paper in my mother's closet. A former North Vietnamese army lieutenant serving in Savon Ket province, Laos, reports seeing two captured Americans as they were tied behind a truck and dragged through the village. He surmised that the Americans could not have survived the torture. Redacted stated that was common knowledge in the capturing unit that the two Americans were captured the night before when their AC-130 was shot down. If this report is true, it's possible that Redacted saw two survivors of the March 1972 loss. Roll up your windows now, Mr. Pei says. We do, watching the villagers' faces grow darker behind the tinted glass. We need to move. Our driver throws the van into gear and we go about 50 feet before we come to a second crossroads. Straight ahead, the path rises and disappears into the trees. To our left is a small wooden bridge crossing a stream. The satellite phone has gone dark, the signal blocked. We have to choose. Take the bridge, please. We lurch forward, and as the huts grow smaller behind us, Liz prays aloud that the road keeps going in this direction. When the next reading comes, it brings bad news. The road is snaking farther and farther away from the coordinates, the decimals dropping. I see a small footpath and point it out. Should we get out and start walking? Half of me is afraid I dreamt it, but when we pull over and kill the engine, the path is still there, just wide enough for a body to slide through. I have no idea how far into the jungle it will take us, or where it even leads. The three of us get out. Liz is about to close the van door when I dash back in, grab my camera, and train it on the woods. I barely feel the branches scratching at my bare arms as we wind our way through the trees. I'm reminded of the warnings in my guidebooks, echoed on the plaque I saw in Zepon. Do not go off trails. Unexploded bombs are still a threat. I am walking toward the last known place of a plane laden with bombs and guiding my friend right toward it. Thank you. That was what we inherit.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, Monica.
So before we enter the next world, and which will take place at a different time, we return to music once again. So please welcome back Benja.
Hi, hi, hi. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Major. And now, from nonfiction to fiction, although fiction based on real events. Our next book tells the story of Charlie Fish, who was a promising young, is it Fish? Yes, Fish, promising young mathematician who in 1944 was brought onto the Manhattan Project, which, as many of you know, was the top secret joint effort of the US government and select universities to build the atomic bomb towards the end of World War II. Charlie is 19. It follows his story and that of his then girlfriend, Brenda, as they spend the rest of their lives together after the war, coming to terms with their participation in such a world-shattering, world-altering event. So Stephen Kiernan, our next author and reader, has published many novels. He will read to us from this book. His latest is called Universe of Two, and it will be released later this summer. Please welcome with me, Stephen Kiernan.
Hello, and thanks for having me along. Nice to see you, and thanks to Beowulf for arranging this as well. I feel like I have to tell a Beowulf story, which is he's a great devout swimmer, and I live near Lake Champlain, and so he photographed me one evening and a little bit in the morning, and then we went down to the lake for a swim. And he decided that the light was too good, and instead he took my photo next to the lake for 45 minutes or so. I'm going to read from the opening of Universe of Two before I explain much about it, just so you can be like any reader picking up a book and coming to it cold. And there's the start of chapter 1, just the first page or so. I met Charlie Fish in Chicago in the fall of 1943. First I dismissed him, then I liked him, then I ruined him, then I saved him. In return, he taught me what love was, lust too, and above all, what it is like to have a powerful conscience. On first impression, Charlie was weak-chinned. To my girlfriends, I might have called him a milquetoast, soft as an old banana, which only goes to show how smart a 19-year-old girl is about anything. Now I know better. It turns out the greatest kinds of strength are hidden and move slowly and cannot be stopped by anything until they have changed the world, which he did twice. I'm not exaggerating. I was there on both occasions. One time I helped him, and the other time I hurt him. I hadn't intended any harm, but there's no denying that I used my influence to make him do terrible things. Irreversible things. He forgave me. That was in his nature. But I haven't forgiven myself, even now, all these many years later. Some deeds are like tattoos, and the ink of regret is permanent. How did it start? As innocently as the chiming of a bell when a shop door opens. So the speaker of that opening is Brenda Doobie, and she is a very sassy Chicago girl in the 1940s who works in her family's music store because they couldn't afford to send her to conservatory as a pianist and organist. And the customer who comes in and makes that bell ring is Charlie Fish, and he's even a little younger than she is, and he's a mathematician who is in over his head in a government project, and he doesn't know what it is. In the course of the novel, he discovers that he's moved from Chicago to New Mexico, and he discovers that he is part of the detonator team to build the atomic bomb. He has great moral misgivings about this, and that's part of his arc. And in the meantime, Brenda's not allowed to know what he's doing for security reasons, so whenever he shows any qualms, she immediately says, you know, time to be a soldier, be a man. At the end of the war, Charlie bears the burden of the devastating success of the weapon that he helped to create. And Brenda understands that she urged this man to disregard his conscience. And so after the war, they spend the rest of their lives seeking redemption together, and they find it. And this novel is about how they find it. The narrative goes back and forth between Brenda's sections and then another narrative voice that has a security clearance that can go inside. So I'm going to read a little bit from a morning, a late night and early morning in July of 1945. And there are a bunch of characters in it, and I wouldn't worry about keeping track. Giles is a guy with a great vocabulary. Mather is a snob. Horn is a superior physicist to everyone else. But our main guy is Charlie, and he has now built the detonator. And this is before anyone knows how strong the atomic bomb might actually be. We're in Alamogordo, a huge desert in New Mexico, and it is 2 o'clock in the morning. At 2 a.m., Giles stood at the tent opening, watching the rain fall, and declared chrysalism. He turned to Charlie, who was stretched out on his cot, but wide awake. Know what I mean? Not in the least. What does today's 10-cent word mean? Chrysalism, the womb-like comfort of being sheltered during a storm. Charlie rolled onto his side to face away. There is no comfort tonight. At 3:30 a.m., Giles roused in his folding chair. The storm had passed. How about petrichor? He asked Charlie. Do you know that one? Charlie barely shook his head. By then he lay on his back, staring at the roof of the tent. The scent of the ground after a rain. Giles widened the tent opening with one finger. I love it. At 4 a.m., the countdown recommenced with a detonation target of 5:30. Half an hour later, Horn returned to the command center. Charlie saw him climbing out of a jeep and hurried over. Thanks for relieving me earlier tonight. Horn smiled. We both feel relief at this point, right? He bobbed from side to side. Now I need to go play goalie. He climbed into another jeep, which took him to the relay tent. Charlie knew from the planning exercises that this is where Horn would sit during the test, manning the only switch that, once the final orders came, could stop a detonation if something went awry. The remaining boys also went to their assigned observation stations. For Charlie and Giles, that meant the southern end of the firing area, where a concrete bunker sat half buried in the sand, a row of windows facing north to the tower. Charlie had felt, after leaving his earlier position, a kind of ease, but now he held his stomach as though it pained him. At 5:09 a.m., the 20-minute countdown began. The announcement came booming over loudspeakers mounted outside of the ranch's command house and radios at the observation bunkers. Charlie recognized the voice in the broadcast. It was Sam Allison, an affable physicist who sang to himself while walking the Manhattan Project's hallways. Charlie knew him from the church choir, too, a clear, steady tenor. Around the bomb, meanwhile, Charlie imagined there was an eerie silence. The top command men occupied a separate shelter. It had a cluster of measuring instruments screwed and bolted onto the roof. One physicist handed out suntan oil to protect the observers from the ultraviolet light. Charlie went off to relieve himself. An MP at the bunker entry called the boys to find secure places. Charlie was surprised to see Mather there, calmly smoking against the wall. When he waved, Mather responded with a cool, slow nod. More boys sardined into the narrow space, clustering by the windows. A few remained outside. They had been instructed to lie on their bellies with their feet to the tower, but none of them did it. Come all this way and not see? Said one, chuckling. Not a chance. The MP stood near them. You're civilian, so you don't have to obey orders, but it's my job to encourage you to comply. Thanks, the technician said, not moving. Job well done. Soon they were all hushed, smoking or talking quietly. They fidgeted. They ignored one another's odors. At the 10-minute mark, the milestone when, aside from Horn at his switch, human control ceased and the automated process began, Charlie rose to relieve himself again. Fish, Mather called. You're as nervous as a cat. I'm fine, he insisted. Too much coffee. And he headed outside. You'd be agitated too, he told the boys, if those were your triggers, all needing to fire at the same instant. Never been done, can't be done, Mather said. Even with Horn's help, Fish isn't smart enough. I've argued that for weeks. Giles bristled. We'll see. Observation planes had flown south from Holloman Air Force Base to monitor from the sky, their noise preventing conversation for a full minute. When Charlie returned from his moment outside the bunker, he stepped carefully over the other boy's legs to reclaim his place near one of the windows. Hey, friend, Giles shifted to make space. Are you afraid it won't go off? Charlie shook his head. I'm afraid that it will. A flare rose into the night sky, 2 minutes till detonation. Mather let out a sigh. I would not want to be Horn right now. No one answered. They knew that even in silence, they had one another, while Horn at the switch was entirely alone. He would need to decide whether or not to proceed based on an array of indicator dials before the countdown reached 6. After that, the process was irrevocable. The observation planes arced up and away, out of range, out of sight. The 1 minute flare rose, bright red in the black sky. As advised, everyone in the vicinity, inside and out, the MP included, lowered welding goggles into place. Silence draped on the bunker like a fog. Hey, Giles said, who wants to head out for a nice cold beer? No one laughed. Time had momentum, a weight they all felt. 10, 9, 8. The signal surged down the wire. 7, 6, 5. By then they knew that Horn had not stopped it. 4, 3, 2. The greatest fuse in human history was lit. 1. There's that.
Let's try that again with my microphone on. Thank you, Stephen, so much.
Sure, my pleasure.
Wow. I have questions. I'm sure a lot of you have questions as well, but we will save those till the end. Although if you want to add them to the chat now, please go ahead. And with that, let me welcome one last time, Benja.
Okay, hi. Here I'm again playing a third variation of that little song called Elliot is Coming.
you, Benja. Give them your hearts.
Thank you.
And now we're coming to our third author, Maya Shanbhag Lang. She's the daughter of Indian immigrants and the author of the forthcoming book, What We Carry, a memoir. She's also a passionate teacher, enjoys working with aspiring writers, and her book is a memoir about caregiving and Alzheimer's. It's about mothers and daughters being the child of immigrants, invisible labor, and growing into the next versions of ourselves. It is about stories we tell ourselves and how those stories shape us, even if they're not true. So please welcome with me, Maya Shanbhag Lang. Great to have you. Hi, Maya.
Hi, thank you so much, Monica. And I want to give a big thank you to House of Beautiful for hosting us. You guys are doing such a lovely job. I also wanted to thank Beowulf Sheehan for putting this together. And for those of you who don't know, Beowulf Sheehan is an amazing photographer. And by coincidence, so Toni Morrison is my favorite author of all time. And I remember looking at her portrait and thinking, whoever captured her, that's an amazing artist. And to then have my author photograph taken by the person who did that, Beowulf, that was a huge moment for me. And it was a real full circle moment that helped me feel like a real author, as Jessica said before. So thank you for the work that you do, for supporting authors, and just for being a lovely soul in this world, truly. So as an aside, I actually never meant to write a memoir. I'm a fiction writer by training, and I was in the middle of working on my second novel when my mother, who had early Alzheimer's and was in need of emergency care, came to live with me in my home. So overnight, my life changed quite dramatically. My daughter was quite young at the time, so I was suddenly juggling motherhood, taking care of my mother with Alzheimer's, and my own career. It was quite a shift for me. And when I was in that juncture, I started writing Facebook posts just as a way to try and, frankly, get some release from that time, but also to capture that time and to try and preserve it and sort of wrap my mind around it. Sometimes when you're in the middle of a story, you can't tell. Just being able to articulate and describe one facet of it can be quite useful. So I was writing these Facebook posts. An editor happened to see the posts, and she reached out to my agent, who said, I think there's a book here. I said, I'm really flattered, but there's no way I could write a memoir. And that same night, I wrote the first 70 pages of this book. So, it's to say editors are almost always right, first of all, but also sometimes we don't know what we're in the middle of, and it takes the perspective of someone else to help us see that. Okay, so without further ado, I thought I would read a little bit from What We Carry. And this is to give you just a feel for our time together. I should also note before I launch in, my mother was a geriatric psychiatrist. So Alzheimer's was her specialty, a disease she knew very well. And not only did she see it in her work with her patients, but she also ran clinical trials for Aricept, which is the main Alzheimer's medication. That was the pill I would give her every morning. So a pill that she helped develop was the pill that she took, which, even though that sounds quite devastating, it was also a moment every morning for me of pride, because it reminded me of who she used to be. Okay, so this is when we're in the midst of her living at my house. My mother operates on her own schedule, waking at noon, still in her pajamas at dinner. She leaves rooms without turning off the lights, accepts the food I cook for her without a word of thanks, makes lists of items she would like me to procure: sneakers, sweaters, socks. She ignores the books I get for her from the library, the YouTube videos I find of Marathi songs. Music, everyone tells me, can bring Alzheimer's patients joy. Try telling that to my mother. Her only pastime as such is to pore over financial statements, counting and recounting her money, making various cryptic notes to make sure it is all there. Is the behavior an anomaly? What is the Alzheimer's and what is her? I've always seen my mother through the lens of her work, a prized psychiatrist who was a champion of her patients. I made this her defining trait because of what it meant for me. By turning up the volume on her compassion, I gave it to myself, a kind of vicarious empathy. She was on her patient's side. Therefore, she was on mine. Truthfully, though, my mother was not a terribly empathetic person. It's just the medication, she said, whenever patients complimented her. I thought she was being modest. She was being sincere. When a person shows you who she is, you should believe her, yet I bent over backward to see otherwise. Focused on the fantasy of a devoted mother, I chose to ignore so much. She could be aloof. She never gave money to the homeless or to charity. She tipped terribly and was curt to strangers. She refused to make skin contact when paying someone. This last trait pained me, for while I could always add dollar bills to restaurant tabletops or outstretched paper cups on sidewalks, while I could murmur kindnesses on her behalf, there was nothing to be done in that awful moment of a transaction when she placed cash or credit card on the counter, pointedly ignoring the person's outstretched hand. Maybe this was because of her Brahmin upbringing and the caste system's reprehensible view of untouchables. But she made the choice to behave that way even after decades in this country. I felt the person's defeat in those moments, the way they became smaller. To her, I was an anomaly. I donated and volunteered, overtipped and overthanked. Once, I admonished my mom about how much service people rely on tips. Oh, she said. That was all. One word followed by ponderous silence, as though being shown a piece of furniture it was too late to return. She mostly kept her judgments to herself, but sometimes they slipped out. Wash your hands when you leave that AIDS place, she advised when I volunteered at a hospice in high school. And put your clothes straight into the laundry. Better to be safe with those people. Those people. The words caused me to hang up on her. They didn't match the mom in my head, the one who had boundless sympathy for others. It's not who I want my mother to be, but it's who she was. Haughty, self-centered, prejudiced, and in her own cheap way, a snob. Seeing her plainly means losing the idealized version of her that has always existed in my head. As my mother and I drop our pretenses, I find that I can ask her anything. I voice all the nagging questions I had as a kid. And one day it occurs to me to ask the biggest question of all. Mom, how did you know you wanted to be a psychiatrist? I didn't, she answers right away. I wanted to be an OBGYN. She explains that she suffered from postural hypotension, meaning she couldn't stand for long periods without getting dizzy. With her dream job ruled out, she settled for psychiatry. That way I could sit in a chair. For the next several days, I am in a state of shock. A neighbor could confess to committing murder, and all I would think about was my mom's desire to be an obstetrician. Psychiatry did not appeal to me at all, she admits. So many problems. It can be very boring, you know. It is the last straw, the final puzzle piece that makes me realize how much I deluded myself where she was concerned. The crux of her whole identity was an accident. She became a psychiatrist out of a desire to be seated. She hadn't planned for me and my brother all along. Her trajectory in life was not a straight line. I sometimes wonder why I didn't go back to India, she says. Staying in this country, you know, it just happened. What a surprise this would have been to hear this as a girl, to know that my mother was someone to whom things happened, that this was permissible. She wanted to give me the illusion that she had known what she was doing. I let her delude me. But this is not to say that those illusions were meaningless. My mother's old stories may have been riddled with untruths, plagued by a suspicious lack of detail, but they defined her. They weren't necessarily true to events, but they were true to her. As a writer, I should have known better. I, of all people, should have understood that a writer need not be truthful in order to be true. A story need not be accurate in order to be true. Now that the illusions have been stripped away, I miss my mythic mom, and I suspect she misses her too. I've been taking care of her physically, but who has she become under my care? She has lost her former stature. She is stronger, able to take the stairs without help, but she lacks her old haughtiness. Maybe it doesn't matter whether our stories are true or false. What matters is that they are ours. On the topic of stories, Beowulf mentioned earlier that we each have stories, and this is what comes through in something like a portrait, you know, our heart or our soul. And I just wanted to read a very quick passage about what stories can mean. One autumn morning, my mother makes herself a cup of tea. I am ecstatic. After weeks of showing her how, weeks during which I'm not sure she retains a thing, weeks during which I wonder why I bother, watching her finally do it is as jubilant a moment as when my daughter took her first steps. The episode also drives home our reality. You made yourself tea, I crow. I did, she replies blankly. She doesn't remember making it, cannot say how the still warm mug came to be in her hands. The accomplishment marks a ceiling in an ever-shrinking space. A woman who once saved lives can now do no more than make tea. It is bittersweet, like building sandcastles on the shore. All that work speaks to its pending erasure. The episode with the tea, though, helps me grasp my situation. I cannot fathom my mother's disease, cannot wrap my mind around it, but a small anecdote involving tea is manageable. It gives me a story, gives me a way to explain the ineffable. It gives me a few lines when the rest of the tale is out of reach. Alzheimer's is devastating because it annihilates one's story. It vacuums it up. Even the name feels greedy to me. What gets me is the apostrophe, that possessive little hook. It drags your loved one away from you. My mother no longer belongs to me. She belongs to the illness. But my time with her is a way of countering that apostrophe. The episode with the tea, in giving me a story, allows me to stake a claim on her. The magnitude of the ocean can be overwhelming, but a sandcastle, however fleetingly, defies that power. Its beauty is more poignant for its brevity. I cannot comprehend what is coming for my mother, the tidal wave of loss. But in the meantime, we have this, tea together in the kitchen, And even if she does not remember it, I will. It is enough to get me through this day and the next. And finally, I just wanted to read one very brief thing because I thought it might speak to us in this particular moment in time and in this juncture we're in. One thing that occurred to me is that I think dealing with an ailing parent or an ailing loved one really puts you in a juncture of uncertainty, which I think is what we are now in with the pandemic. We don't know what the future will hold. We don't know what milestones to look to. Our typical scripts are out the window. We don't know what our roles should be. And that's very much what I faced when caring for my mother. And this was something that I wrote when I was really in that space of feeling like I wasn't sure if I could do it or how to manage it. Illness, mortality, the complexity of caring for an ailing loved one. No one would choose to face these scenarios, but in moments of crisis, when we have no choice, we submit. To our surprise, we endure. What choice is there? The not badness of it is a beautiful thing, a sign that we are much stronger than we know. I thought this was going to be a dark and difficult time for my family, one of strain, and of course it is. But it occurs to me that diamonds are not made voluntarily. What lump of coal would ever choose so much time and pressure? It could be that what shapes us against our choosing is what makes us shine.
Thank you, Maya. That was really lovely. Thank you. So now, in the time remaining, we'd love to open up the space for all those of you who have been listening so intently. If you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself, or you can post it in the chat, and Monica and I will be monitoring that. So thanks again to all our authors again, and to Beowulf and to Benja. And yeah, Monica?
We'll await your questions, I guess, if you have any.
Well, I've got a question for Stephen. You know, we live in interesting times. There's a lot to be said about the moment we're in. I would say even for the last 10 years, let alone right now. So what is the value of historical fiction in times like this?
Oh boy, well, you know, there's a challenge to it because if you write about World War II, right, there's a whole literature of World War II, English language literature of World War II, and there's some fantastic books that have been written.
Intimidating, I would think.
Yes, exactly. It's very intimidating. But you know, I think there's, I'm reminded of Ezra Pound's comment, you know, that literature is news that stays news. So I think about kind of two angles. For me, the atomic bomb was interesting because I learned that many of the people that were involved in building it opposed its use, and they wrote, you know, petitions to the president and so on, and they were roundly ignored. But that dissent to me felt like that conflict would be an interesting thing to explore, and that this year, this summer, is the 75th anniversary of the bomb. And, you know, when the 75th anniversary of D-Day came last year, there was a lot of very respectful recollection of the honor and sacrifice of that day. And that this is a more ambiguous anniversary, and that would be an interesting thing to explore from the human perspective, from a character perspective. The other thing is that since you have these young men, mostly, some women, but mostly young men, involved in building a bomb, and many of them not wanting to be, there is the question of conscience. And conscience is not a thing that we talk much about or think much about now. There's much more like a public accountability of people's behavior that exists, much less than the internal accountability. We all know, we're all human, we all know what it's like when we behave in a way that doesn't get along with our conscience. And it's a question of how we get square with ourselves. So here we have this man and woman who disregarded their consciences, who have the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people in part on their conscience, and how they find redemption. And that path, I think the lessons of their struggle and their success in that may be useful to us now.
Yeah.
Jessica, I have a question for you, actually, just to move between the stories as we've just done. Could you share a bit more about the process of writing this first book of yours? Because it took 10 years, and just from the brief glimpse that you shared with us, it sounds like a true adventure. So maybe you can share a few specific moments that come to mind.
Of course. And one of the reasons I really wanted to write this book was that, I grew up with my grandfather's World War II stories. His medals were on the wall. He marched in every Memorial Day parade. But I didn't know my uncle really existed until my mother passed away, and I found thousands of pages of declassified documents in my family home. And in America, what happened in Laos is called the Secret War. But when I went to Laos 40 years after my grandfather's trip to find his son, I'll never forget it. One of the most iconic things I saw, I was in the town my uncle was bombing, Zepan, and there was a child's Superman pajamas hanging on this laundry line, this iconic symbol of American heroes, right? And then it was over a bomb crater left by American bombs, perhaps even my uncle's plane. And it was just such a gutting moment for me. When I originally started this book 10 years ago, it was going to be strictly investigative reporting based on the documents, my conversations with CIA officers and refugees. But I was in bed one morning with all these papers, because I did it while working full time, and something cold and metallic slipped onto my lap, and that was my uncle's actual dog tags. They had touched his skin, they had touched my grandfather, my mother, and that's the moment when I realized I had to make this story personal. As Stephen beautifully said, I think when we talk about these big historical moments, I think we've all read the history books, but how do you feel when you're one of the decision makers or one of the family members kind of wrestling with the consequences of that? And one other quick thing I'll say too, the interview process was so fascinating for this. I talked to one CIA officer who described the Russians and the Chinese and the Vietnamese like having whiskey, these wild parties in Vientiane at night, and then going back to the war and killing each other the next day. And just, right now we're living our daily lives, we're in quarantine. I think it can be really hard to distinguish one day from the next, but even in this moment in history that we're looking back on and writing about, there was still day-to-day life happening, and I wanted to kind of explore that too. And I knew that to take my readers there, I too would have to go to Laos, and that's why I made that journey and share so much of it in the book.
Thanks for sharing. And Maya, just because we touched on it now with Stephen and Jessica as well, with this current situation, and you mentioned it before. So last Sunday we had a session that was dedicated to the new collective narrative, sort of what is the post-pandemic narrative, and we started co-writing that in one of these living room sessions. And I'm curious to hear from you. What are some stories for the post-pandemic era that you envision or that you could see that you might want to share?
What a question. I think I definitely got the tough one among the authors. But, one thing I'll say is that, well, two things I'll say. I think one thing I learned while caring for my mother and facing the uncertainty of that and the open-endedness of that, and the fact that, if you're caring for a child, there are certain milestones and what the progression will look like, and you have a lot of resources, and there are blogs and books and articles, and so you feel kind of equipped even during the tough moments, versus caring for a parent, you kind of feel out at sea because you don't know what that role reversal should look like. You don't know how it's going to unfold. You don't know how much time you have. And I remember at some point thinking, well, we never know how much time we have with one another, right? Like that fundamental uncertainty really is always there in life. And just certain junctures make that uncertainty more clear to us. So, I think during crisis, part of what we realize is that we recognize the illusions we've been carrying along the whole time. And I think part of what we miss is our old illusions. So right now during the pandemic, we are faced with a lot of uncertainty, et cetera. But if you think about it, during normal life, truthfully, anything can happen at any time, as so many of us have experienced with sudden loss, sudden changes of fate. So I think part of what we are currently sort of mourning, or what we miss so much, I think we're kind of in a collective withdrawal. I think we miss that protected feeling and being sort of bubble wrapped from uncertainties that are kind of always there in life. And I think our takeaway, two things. I think whenever you really are in that juncture of having to sit with uncertainty, you become more resilient. And I also think there are a lot of questions that come up of self-examination and looking at your life and your support systems, and there's a re-examination that occurs that can only lead to good things. So I think we will come out stronger, but as with the coal being turned into diamond analogy, coming out stronger and more brilliant and with greater clarity is not a fun process. And it usually happens not with the challenges that we opt into, but the challenges that are foisted upon us.
Beautiful, thank you, Maya. And as we're coming to a close here, I would love to give Beowulf another chance to share, because he is the reason that we're all here today and he brought us here together. So Beowulf, I'll hand you the last words.
Oh, that's so very kind. Thank you, Monica. I'm thinking of these three works we've just heard excerpts from in these wonderful writers now. And their stories are taking me back to the question which Megan had asked, which is, of course, what is it that is special about authors? And Maya spoke, of course, to the place that we're in. And what we can't do for each other physically, we can do for each other in other ways. And that's what we're doing for each other right now. What we're doing for each other is exactly what every writer does and what every book does, which is to give and share empathy. There's something in each of their stories that had touched me. For Jessica, this notion of learning and learning to let go. For Maya, the sense of comfort, because I also lost my father to Alzheimer's. And from Stephen, the notion that love and life are very complex things. Those are all issues that will touch each and every one of us. Thank you all so much for those gifts.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Megan, you want to, I think you're...
I'm muted again. I'm so sorry. Thank you, everyone. It's lovely to see all these faces from all over the world. It's truly delightful. We invite you to check out Jessica, Maya's, and Stephen's books, as well as Beowulf's book, and to buy books whenever and however you can. I know it's difficult. We talked about Amazon is not shipping some places, they are shipping in others. And of course, the author a day proceeds only work, I think, if you buy them in the US, because this is a very complicated story as to why global book sales are the way they are. But we're working it out as a people. Anyhow, thank you for supporting our authors by showing up here today. Please continue to do so. And please join us for future living room sessions. There are a few more to come, and it's such a joy for us all. So with that,
Yes.
good rest of the day wherever you are.
Yes, and a last quick note. So please do come back and thank you all, Beowulf, Jessica, Maya, and Stephen, and Benja. And this week is dedicated to the ability to feel with someone. So Beowulf, you just talked about empathy. So we'll continue tomorrow, actually, with the future of love and relationships. So you want to come back, you're very welcome to. And as always, we'll close with a song. So stay if you like and enjoy your Sunday. Thank you.
Rather characters whose lives unfold, and bring you coffee in the morning when outside it's cold. While you read the first draft, you say this is gold. In a dream, that's where I am until I find the literary stream. And then I'll swim to save my life and write a book about your wife and how she sits inside her house all day and writes and writes. The pages bound, the crowd applauding at the writer's fair. Each person takes a copy home to bed.